What if a language survived for 300 years and nobody could explain how? What if a single DNA test quietly proved that the history books got it wrong? Before we go further, if stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe right now, tap that like button, and send this to one person who loves a good mystery. You'll want to see where this one ends up. There's a stretch of coastline running through South Carolina, Georgia, and northern Florida that most maps barely notice. Marsh grass, tidal creeks, small islands separated from the mainland by water and time. People call this region the Sea Islands, and the people who have lived here for over 3 centuries call themselves Gullah Geechee. For most of American history, almost nobody outside this region knew much about them. They spoke a language that confused linguists for generations. It sounded a little like English, it sounded a little like West African speech patterns, but it wasn't quite either one. Scholars studied it, recorded it, argued about it for over 100 years, and kept landing on the same frustrating answer. It didn't fit into any existing category. That alone should have been a clue that something unusual happened here. But for a long time, historians had a tidy explanation, and tidy explanations are comfortable. They said, these are descendants of enslaved Africans who were isolated on coastal plantations, cut off from the rest of the country. And that isolation let them hold onto fragments of African culture that other communities lost. It's a reasonable story. It's also incomplete. And the moment scientists started reading the DNA of Gullah Geechee communities, that comfortable explanation started to crack. Let's set the scene properly, because context matters here. Slavery in America was not just a system of forced labor. It was a system specifically engineered to break connection. Enslaved people were taken from different regions of West and Central Africa, often deliberately mixed with others who didn't share their language or customs. Specifically so, they couldn't organize, couldn't communicate, couldn't pass down a shared identity. Families were split apart and sold separately. Names were erased and replaced. Spiritual practices were banned. This wasn't an accident of the system, it was the system, and it worked tragically in most parts of the country. Across the American South, the vast majority of African American communities experienced a kind of cultural erosion across generations. Original languages faded. Specific ethnic identities blurred into a broader American identity. This was not a failure of the people. It was the result of a brutal and intentional strategy. So when you look at the Gullah Geechee and you see a community that kept a living Creole language, distinct spiritual traditions with clear African roots, food customs passed down almost untouched, and even agricultural knowledge tied directly back to specific regions of West Africa, you have to ask a real question. How did this one community escape what almost destroyed cultural continuity everywhere else? The first answer historians reached for was geography. The Sea Islands were hard to get to. Malaria was common in the marshes, which kept many white plantation owners away for long stretches of the year. Without constant oversight, enslaved communities on these islands had more room to maintain their own customs, their own rhythms, their own internal world. This is true, and it matters. But here's the problem. Isolation by itself only explains why something might survive. It doesn't explain why it survived in such a specific, detailed, almost recognizable form. Think about it this way. If isolation were the whole story, you'd expect a kind of cultural blending. A mix of different African traditions fused loosely together, the way you'd expect from a community made up of people pulled from dozens of different regions. That's actually what happened in many other parts of the American South. But that's not what researchers found when they studied Gullah Geechee traditions closely. The spiritual practices weren't a vague blend of African religion. They showed specific structural elements traceable to particular groups: Yoruba, Menda, Congo. The rice farming techniques weren't generic agricultural knowledge. They matched, almost precisely, methods used in a particular farming region of West Africa. And when linguists studied the grammar of Gullah Creole itself, they found patterns that mirrored Sierra Leonean Creole so closely. It couldn't be coincidence. This wasn't culture surviving in fragments. This was culture surviving with precision. And precision needs a different explanation than simple isolation. That different explanation has a name now. Historians call it the Rice Coast Hypothesis. And once you understand it, the whole story shifts. In the early 1700s, plantation owners in coastal South Carolina wanted to grow rice. There was just one problem. They didn't actually know how to do it. Rice farming, especially the specific kind suited to tidal marshland, isn't something you can guess your way through. It requires deep, specific knowledge. How to read tidal flooding cycles, how to prepare marshy soil, how to manage water flow across rice fields season by season. There was, however, a region of West Africa where this exact knowledge already existed. A stretch of coastline known historically as the Rice Coast, covering parts of what is today Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Senegal. People there had been cultivating African rice for generations. They understood this ecosystem the way master craftsman understands their tools. So South Carolina planters did something chillingly calculated. They began specifically requesting, and paying extra for enslaved people taken from this exact region. Not because of any concern for their humanity, because of their expertise. They wanted the knowledge inside these people's minds, and they were willing to pay a premium to get it. This is documented. Historical shipping and purchase records back it up. And it had a consequence that the planters almost certainly never intended. By specifically targeting one narrow region of West Africa, plantation owners accidentally concentrated people who already shared language roots, shared cultural frameworks, shared spiritual systems. Instead of the usual strategy of mixing unrelated groups to prevent unity, this particular practice did the opposite. It created communities with a real, coherent, shared foundation. In other words, the very system designed to extract labor and profit ended up planting the seeds of cultural survival, purely by accident, purely out of greed. This theory explains a lot, but it still wasn't the full picture. And this is where the science enters the story and takes things somewhere genuinely unexpected. Starting in the late 2000s and accelerating through the 2010s, geneticists began running detailed ancestry studies on Gullah Geechee populations. The expectation going in was simple. They assumed they'd find what most African American genetic studies find: a broad mix of West and Central African ancestry, some European admixture from the plantation era, maybe small traces of indigenous American ancestry. And they did find some of that. But the data also showed something else, something that didn't line up neatly with the standard historical narrative of the slave trade. A 2016 study published in the American Journal of Human Genetics, along with follow-up research from genetic ancestry projects focused specifically on African heritage, began mapping haplogroups. Those are specific genetic markers passed down through either the maternal or paternal line across African American populations with far greater precision than earlier studies allowed. When researchers focused specifically on Gullah Geechee communities, the results stood out. There were elevated frequencies of particular haplogroups, both maternal and paternal lines, that are today concentrated specifically in regions of Sierra Leone and the Senegambia area. That part fit the Rice Coast story well. But there was something more striking buried in the data. Within those African genetic lineages, the clustering was unusually tight, meaning many individuals across Gullah Geechee communities shared common ancestors, not just broadly in the sense of we're all from West Africa, but specifically tracing back to identifiable communities within a narrow region of West Africa. Let's pause on why that matters, because it's easy to read past this point without grasping how significant it is. The standard slave trade, as historically documented, deliberately mixed people from dozens of different ethnic groups and regions to prevent solidarity. That's part of why so many African American communities, tragically, lost specific connections to particular African ethnic identities. The diversity was, in a horrifying way, engineered. But in Gullah Geechee communities, that diversity was compressed. The genetic picture is tighter, more specific, more traceable than what's typically found elsewhere. This pattern lines up with something more targeted than even the Rice Coast hypothesis fully explains on its own. So let's actually sit inside this story for a moment, because numbers and haplogroups can feel distant until you put a human face on them. Picture a village along the coast of what is today Sierra Leone, sometime in the early 1700s. You belong to the Menda people. Your community has worked this particular stretch of coastal land for generations. You know which crops do well in which soil. You know how the tides move through the rice paddies during the rainy season. You know the names of the spirits tied to this specific land, passed down through stories told by your grandparents. Then, within months, a large portion of your community disappears, not scattered randomly to different corners of the world, the way so many enslaved people were. Instead, a significant number of you are transported together across an ocean to a landscape that, almost eerily, resembles the one you were taken from. The same tidal creeks, the same marshland, the same flat coastal horizon stretching to the sea. Your knowledge is the reason you were taken in the first place. And in this new place, that same knowledge becomes the reason you're given something most enslaved people were never given: a degree of operational control. This isn't speculation. It's documented. On many Sea Island rice plantations, it was enslaved Gullah Geechee workers who actually ran the rice operations. They directed the labor. They trained newly arrived workers. They managed the technical side of cultivation that the plantation owners themselves didn't understand. And in doing that work, they preserved something the system never intended to let survive: continuous social structure, lines of communication, the ability to pass knowledge, language, and tradition from one person to the next, generation after generation, in a way that was nearly impossible almost everywhere else under slavery. This is the turn in the story that changes everything. The Gullah Geechee weren't simply fortunate survivors of cultural destruction, holding onto scraps by sheer luck. In a deeply painful historical irony, The very expertise that made them targets for enslavement became the mechanism that allowed their culture to survive intact. Their captors needed them to remain, in a sense, who they already were, needed them to retain their knowledge of rice, needed them to be able to communicate with each other, organize labor, and train others. And in creating the conditions to exploit that knowledge, the system inadvertently created the conditions for one of the most remarkable examples of cultural continuity in the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade. That's worth sitting with. The thing that should have erased them ended up preserving them instead. Now here's where it's worth pausing for a second, CTA, because if this kind of layered history fascinates you, context matters. The way one overlooked detail can completely rewrite a story you thought you understood. There's a simple way to make sure you don't miss the next one. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications if you can, because we cover stories exactly like this one regularly, and they tend to surprise even people who think they already know history well. Let's keep going. Because the genetic evidence is doing something even bigger than confirming a historical theory. It's confirming something the community itself never forgot. Researchers connected to the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor have described a pattern that shows up again and again. When they bring DNA results back to community elders, it isn't shock, it isn't disbelief, it's recognition. One elder on St. Helena Island, South Carolina, was shown a genetic result pointing to a primary ancestral cluster in Sierra Leone and Guinea. Her response wasn't surprise. She reportedly said something close to, "That's where the rice knowledge comes from. We always knew that." Let that sink in for a moment. The science arrived, after 3 centuries, at a place this community had never actually left in their own minds. The DNA wasn't telling them something new about themselves. It was confirming, with hard evidence, something they had carried as oral memory. That's a profound thing. For generations, outside historians treated Gullah Geechee oral traditions as folklore. Interesting, maybe charming, but not necessarily literal fact. The genetics are now suggesting those stories were closer to literal truth than anyone outside the community gave them credit for. There's something worth reflecting on here about how knowledge moves through history. Written records, the ones historians traditionally trust most, were created almost entirely by the people running the system of slavery. Shipping manifests, plantation ledgers, bills of sale. These documents were never designed to preserve the humanity, identity, or specific origins of the people they described. They were designed to track property, and property records, by design, leave enormous gaps. But there's another kind of record that the system never managed to fully erase. It moves silently through every generation, through every act of violence designed to sever connection, through every forced separation, every renaming, every attempt to strip identity away. It's encoded in DNA, passed from parent to child, carrying a kind of geography that no historical document fully captured. That's what makes this story bigger than just one community's history. It's a demonstration that some forms of memory are more durable than the systems built to destroy them. And that raises a question that goes far beyond the Sea Islands. If the Gullah Geechee retained this much, this specifically, this coherently, what does that suggest about other African diaspora communities scattered across the Americas, the Caribbean, South America? Communities whose cultural continuities might be less visible, less documented, maybe even less celebrated, simply because no one has applied this same level of genetic and historical attention to them yet? What knowledge is sitting quietly inside food traditions, inside musical rhythms and patterns, inside spiritual practices, that have been passed down for generations without anyone fully tracing where they actually came from? How many other communities are holding pieces of a story that genetic science simply hasn't reached yet? This is where DNA research is becoming something much bigger than a tool for individual curiosity. It's becoming a tool for historical correction, slowly, imperfectly, because genetic data alone can't capture everything, can't name specific villages or families with full certainty, but with a level of precision that's beginning to challenge histories that were originally written by people with reasons to leave details out. Let's also be honest about what we still don't know, because intellectual honesty matters here. The genetics can't tell us the exact villages individual ancestors came from. It can't trace the precise route every single haplogroup took across the ocean and through generations. The records from that era are incomplete, and that incompleteness wasn't accidental. The system that built this diaspora had no interest in preserving the personal histories of the people it displaced, but DNA turned out to be a kind of record that couldn't be destroyed the way paper records can be lost, burned, or never written. It survived every attempt at separation. It carried encoded in its sequence a specificity, a sense of homeland, that no amount of historical violence could fully erase. And what that tells us, ultimately, is that the Gullah Geechee story isn't just a story about survival in the simple sense. It's a story about the actual limits of erasure, about how certain kinds of knowledge move through time in ways that prove more resilient than the system specifically built to wipe them out. Before we close this out, here's one more way to support the channel if this story moved you even a little. Drop a comment telling us which part surprised you most: the language puzzle, the rice knowledge, or the DNA clustering. It genuinely helps more people discover stories like this, and I read every single comment. So let's bring this back to where we started. A language nobody could fully classify. A community that held onto traditions everyone assumed should have faded generations ago. And a scientific explanation that arrived 300 years late, only to confirm what the people living it already knew in their bones. The Gullah Geechee were never simply a remote, forgotten community that got lucky. They were never just a fragment preserved by accident. They are, and have always been, something closer to a living archive. An archive of a specific place, a specific people, a specific kind of knowledge that crossed an ocean under conditions designed to make survival impossible. And the most striking part of this whole story might be this: the data isn't finished. Researchers are still uncovering new layers, new connections, new specificity within these genetic patterns, which means we are only beginning to understand how deep this particular archive actually goes. What started as an unexplainable language on a forgotten stretch of coastline turned out to be something else entirely. Not a mystery to be solved and closed. A door slowly opening onto a history far more resilient than anyone outside gave it credit for. And maybe that's the real lesson buried inside all of this. History isn't only written in documents controlled by the powerful. Sometimes it survives quietly in language and food and rhythm and memory passed mouth to mouth for 300 years. And sometimes it takes a strand of DNA to finally make the world listen to what a community had been saying all along.